Hello, I'm Lynda Kinkade, live at the CNN headquarters here in Atlanta, and this is One World. The Taliban has finally revealed their new caretaker government more than 3 weeks after seizing control of Afghanistan. As expected, the cabinet is made up of men with deep roots in the Taliban, with Mullah Mohammed Hassan Akhund named Prime Minister, and the group's co-founder, Mullah Abdul Ghani Barada, as the Deputy Prime Minister. But even before that announcement was made by the Taliban spokesman, seen here, a clear picture was emerging of how the Islamic militants plan to rule. Those scenes showing the Taliban fighters firing warning shots into the air in Kabul earlier to disperse a group of protesters. Demonstrators and journalists were reportedly detained, some of them beaten. Dozens, perhaps hundreds, had taken to the streets to chant anti-Pakistan slogans and demand rights for women. The Taliban says a permanent government has been announced, and Nick Robertson is following the developments, joining us now from Islamabad. Nick, good to have you with us. So the previous government, the democratically elected government, included women. The Taliban today announcing some key positions. What can you tell us about those in charge?
Well, this doesn't seem to be inclusive in the terms that I think the international community understood it would be inclusive to include members of the former government. Neither do we see any women there in senior positions, and the idea of a women's ministry is something that will be tackled later. This is being called a caretaker government. But I think if you run from the top down, the Prime Minister, he was the former governor in Kandahar, the shadow governor, of course, because the real government at that time was in charge. He had a reputation for being conservative, for being religious, for running the shadow governorate under strict Sharia Islamic law, that there were hangings for adulterers. His deputy, Mullah Barada, the interlocutor, the negotiator with the United States, gets that sort of second-tier position. I think the two sort of key security positions, if you will, defense ministry is interesting. We'd understood there was a real contest inside the Taliban for that. That has gone to Mullah Yaqub, who is the son of the Taliban's founder, Mullah Omar. And a UN report earlier this year had said that Mullah Yaqub was jockeying to get a senior position within the Taliban. He's secured that. Defense minister, a powerful leader in the sort of military terms inside the Taliban. Sirajuddin Haqqani, who is designated by the United States and by the United Nations for connections with terrorism, also believed to have strong ties to Al-Qaeda. He is now the Interior Ministry, a very strong and powerful position because he will be looking out for all of the Taliban's internal enemies inside the country, and the Al-Qaeda, in terms of what the Taliban have told the United States in the past, will be one of those he's got to keep an eye on, because the Taliban has pledged the United States Al-Qaeda will not use Afghan territory to attack the United States. So, but very interesting that Sirajuddin Haqqani, essentially with these strong ties to Al-Qaeda, and has his own strong internal network inside the Taliban, should get this position. I think that speaks to the power plays that have been going on inside the Taliban at the moment. Caretaker government, is this a fudge within the Taliban because of their own internal disputes, or is it a fudge to tell the international community, we might be able to change this up a little bit later on? Certainly this is not what the international community was looking for under the banner of inclusive.
Exactly. And I want to ask you a little bit more about how women are doing right now in Afghanistan under the Taliban, because under last time under Taliban rule, women were denied human rights, the right to an education, the right to get a job, the right to move freely. We saw earlier today in Kabul those protests, both women and men, protesting Taliban rule, protesting for women's rights, and protesting against Pakistan's support for the Taliban. How are women in Afghanistan doing right now?
You know, I think they're living in fear for the most part. Certainly those in the cities, certainly those who've been used to, you know, a constitution that until a couple of weeks ago, or it may still be intact today, although we now have this Taliban government, the constitution said that there should be, you know, a quarter of the representatives in the government should be women. Well, see, at the moment, on the face of it, there's zero female representation in the government. You know, under the Taliban back in the 90s, they denied women any education at all. There were some classrooms, they were underground, they were kept quiet. The Taliban this time are saying, okay, women can get an education, but they're very clearly sort of putting strict controls around it, making it a separate entity to men's education. Small classes can have a curtain down the middle. Women and girls have to show up at different times to men. So, you know, we don't know how this is all going to play out, but certainly for human rights organizations who monitor the rights of women in Afghanistan, this is a very worrying moment. And for the women in Afghanistan, as we've seen, this young generation take to the streets wanting those rights, this is a moment where they may be watching that slip away in front of their eyes.
Yeah, it certainly seems that way at this point in time. Nick Robertson for us. Good to have you with us as always. Thanks so much. Well, top US officials are in the region holding crisis talks on Afghanistan. Secretary of State Antony Blinken and Secretary of Defense Lloyd Austin met with Qatar's foreign minister during their visit to Doha. Blinken reported progress when it came to evacuating the remaining US citizens out of Kabul. But Austin said Washington could face setbacks when it comes to identifying threats against the US.
There's no question that it will be more difficult to identify and engage threats that emanate from the region, but we're committed to making sure that threats are not allowed to develop and create significant challenges for us in the homeland.
Well, CNN Sam Kiley joins me now live from Doha. And Sam, I want to ask you about those comments in just a moment, but first I want to focus on the new government announced by the Taliban. The Haqqani network, which of course has close ties to al-Qaeda, is part of the new Taliban government. And this, of course, is a group that the US declared a terrorist organization back in 2012. And the head of that network has a $5 million bounty on his head. He's now the Interior Minister, right?
Yeah, he's the Interior Minister, and the Defense Minister is the son of the founding father of the first emir of the Taliban, Mullah Omar, himself killed a few years ago. So these two hardliners are going to be exactly the individuals, perhaps, in the future that the United States will be looking to prevent the establishment of terrorist groups inside Afghanistan. Without them, perhaps, it would be extremely difficult, as the Secretary of State for Defense hinted there, or said outright, indeed, over-the-horizon operations against terrorist groups are much harder if you don't have people on the ground. The people on the ground with whom the United States might have to work are these people who in the past, particularly Sirajuddin Haqqani, have a record for terrorist attacks themselves, historically to pretty close connections with al-Qaeda. So, as Nick was saying there, you know, it will fall to the Interior Ministry and the Defense Ministries to keep an eye on groups such as al-Qaeda. They are closer to the Taliban than ISIS-K, which is the brand of ISIS that emanated out of Syria, is much, much stronger inside Europe and in North Africa than it is in Afghanistan, largely an internal threat at the moment for Afghanistan. But if those two ministries are unable to get a grip on Afghanistan, arguably ungoverned spaces will become, in the future, places that terrorists can plot attacks such as the 9/11. I have to say that in the last 20 years, possibly because they've been preoccupied with a war, those groups have not been able to construct the sorts of attacks that we've seen across Europe in the past that have been generated very much at home. A lot of them lone wolf attacks, and almost always associated with ISIS, not al-Qaeda. So it's a very strange, weird irony now, and it's going to be a really important challenge for the Taliban if they want the trade and the aid that they hope to be able to attract to their country in order to keep their country moving forward, and particularly in order to keep the various fractious elements that they've got to try and bestride in this country. They're both ethnic tensions, religious tensions, political tensions. They're going to have to work extremely hard to do that.
Yeah, certainly sounds that way. All right, Sam Kiley for us in Doha. Good to have you with us. Thank you. Well, Afghanistan is, of course, teetering on the edge of a full-blown humanitarian crisis. The UN says basic services there are collapsing and food is about to run out. The Taliban has made their ideology clear, but so far they haven't revealed how they plan to govern a country in need. Lindsay Hilsum reports.
Taliban fighters in Kabul, freshly arrived from their victory in the Panjshir Valley. They cruise the streets and rule the roost. Young bucks with newly acquired American weapons. It's their moment, their city, their country. They raised the Taliban flag in the Panjshir provincial capital. They've defeated the last resistance. The late warlord Ahmed Shah Massoud, the lion of the Panjshir, looks down from the walls of the provincial governor's office as the Talibs celebrate. Back in the 1990s, the Taliban never defeated his militia, but today they say they've vanquished fighters under the command of his son. At a hospital run by the Italian NGO Emergency, the wards are full of injured people. A few years back, Haji Asadullah's son was paralyzed by a stray bullet. He himself was one of a few people wounded in crossfire as the Taliban entered Kabul 3 weeks ago.
از اول سال تا آخرش از اول عمر تا آخر عمر فقط صلح امنیت میخوایم صلح امنیت میخوایم ما جنگ هیچ وقت نمیخوایم جنگ خور نیستیم صلح امنیت میخوایم.
But the legacy of conflict is poverty. About 600 families who fled their homes in the provinces are surviving in a filthy field on the outskirts of the capital. Abdul Malik and his family fled Baghlan after his home was blown up in fighting.
لیکن حالا ما جا برم مجبور ما کجا برم دیگه کم برم خود خرابه برم در خرابه دیگه چیزی نه چیزی خدای ندارم یعنی مثل 4 نفر هستیم برادرتان غیر خدا و اینمی خیمه دیگه چیزی ندارم بیادر.
Everyone wants to tell me their story. No food, no work, sons killed. 5 million Afghans have been displaced in 2 decades of war. The UN says 18 million, nearly half the population, will need humanitarian assistance this year. Some people here have fled war, others have fled poverty, but most have fled both. They have lives of terrible deprivation. This camp was bigger about a week ago because some people feel that they can now go home because the war is over. But the people I've been speaking to say they don't dare go home. And although violence may now be decreasing, because of the terrible economic problems that the Taliban is facing, poverty is only going to get worse, and the humanitarian needs greater than ever. The head of the UN humanitarian agency flew to Kabul to meet the Taliban.
I think they're surprised that they are where they are today. I think we're going to get quite difficult questions of their capacity to rule in terms of humanitarian issues in the coming weeks. I came here 23 years ago to negotiate the same issues with the Taliban in Kabul in 1998. They're different now, clearly, from then. They're making the right noises, they're making commitments.
But some people say by doing all this you're just normalising these people, and it should not be normalised.
Humanitarians don't normalise. Humanitarian community does not recognise. Humanitarian community is focused on one thing and one thing alone, and that's delivering to the people in need what they need at the right time.
Every day, hundreds of people crowd round the banks. They're not getting salaries and can only withdraw a limited amount from their savings. The middle class are becoming poor, and the poor are becoming destitute.
حکومت نه همیست که امنیت تامین کنن اما اقتصاد در نظر بگیرن. اقتصاد سکوت کرده، رشد آینده ما چطور شود، معلم استاد، دکتر استاد، همه چیز بسیار با مشکلات از مردم.
The Taliban are enjoying themselves, but running a country isn't the same as winning a war, and forcing your ideology on people won't feed their families. We'll soon find out what really matters to Afghanistan's new rulers.
That was Lindsay Hilsom from the UK's Channel 4 News reporting there.